The United States is at a historic turning point. Putin's Russia has the plot. North Korea is becoming an increasingly significant threat. Iran is on the verge of getting its hand on the nuclear bomb, and above all, the People's Republic of China hopes to challenge the US for the top spot as the world's great superpower.
The threats we face today are more formidable than at any time in the last 20 years. Mike Rogers, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee.
Perhaps that is why the United States has by far the highest military budget on the planet. However, despite this, some analysis, such as that of the Heritage Foundation, states that the readiness of the US Armed Forces is currently weak. The United States spends a lot, but it also has far more commitments than any other country. In addition, the United States spends a lot in absolute terms, but less and less in relative terms. If we take into account inflation, rising equipment costs, and wages, the level of spending in recent years may not be as high. In fact, if we just adjust military budgets by the price level of each country, for example, what it costs to have a soldier or what supplies cost, the story changes quite a bit. Notice, for example, this 2019 chart. The first column is US military spending. The second is the sum of the military spending of China, India, and Russia. As you can see, US military spending is much higher. But what happens if we adjust the budgets by the US price level? This is exactly what happens. The US superpower still spends more than anyone else, but the difference is no longer so large. And in any case, unlike other countries, the military is no longer Washington's top priority. You don't believe me? Well, look at this chart. This is how the federal budget has evolved in recent years. As you can see, the US government is spending more and more. In fact, in terms of GDP, non-military spending has grown by almost 50% since the turn of the century, from 12.6% of GDP to 18.6%. However, the same has not been true for military spending, a smaller and smaller item within the federal budget. Take a look. As a result, military spending is becoming a smaller and smaller part of the federal budget. In addition, the military budget has recently included billions of dollars for things like limiting the military CO2 and other greenhouse gas emissions, which may be a good idea, but which clearly does not determine military capability. For example, this document that you see here is the implementation plan of the climate change strategy for the years 2023 to 2027. And this is but one example. Of course, this lack of priority has consequences. For example, the last major army modernization plans were carried out in the 1980s, almost 40 years ago. We're talking about, for example, the appearance of the M1 Abrams tank, the M2 Bradley, or the Black Hawk and Apache helicopters. Yes, obviously they have improved and are still ahead of their rivals, but we're talking about equipment that appeared almost 40 years ago. That is a long time. And take note, because we can find a very similar situation in the Air Force. Since 1987, the number of fighters, bombers, refueling, and transport aircraft has not only been reduced by more than 30%, but today, the aircraft are on average much older. To give you an idea, the average age of US Air Force aircraft is 29.4 years. Yes, that's right, 29.4 years. A whole year older than me. In fact, the average age of some aircraft, such as B-52 bombers or KC-135 refueling aircraft, exceeds 60 years. The average age of the F-15C is 37.8 years, and that of the F-16C and D versions exceeds 31 years. And yes, I know, most of them are up to date, but we're talking in general about very dated equipment, and it shows. Well, all this has led many analysts to fear that the same thing will happen to the armed forces as has happened to infrastructure, that they will go from being excellent to being terribly decrepit. As Washington has other priorities on where and how to spend money, military systems will gradually age to alarming levels. In other words, the fear is that the ever-increasing social spending will swallow up everything else. Surprised? Well, we're just getting started. Pay close attention to the second major problem, a problem that the war in Ukraine has brought into sharp focus. Listen up.
Warning, too much bureaucracy, not enough ammunition.
Most people living on this planet know that the United States has the most powerful military in the world, and has had for decades. What is not so well known is that these armed forces could face a serious problem: lack of ammunition and supplies. This is something that has been witnessed all too well in the Ukrainian war. A modern large-scale war is, and will be, first and foremost, an industrial war. That is to say, an army not only has to have the best weapons, it also has to have guaranteed supplies, including, logically, ammunition. For example, it is estimated that the United States has shipped about 1/3 of its entire stockpile of Javelin anti-tank missiles and Stinger anti-aircraft missiles to Ukraine. To give you an idea, at current production rates, it would take more than 7 years to replenish the stock delivered to Ukraine. In the case of the Stinger, if we look at its production level before it was completely stopped, we're talking about more than 13 long years. And the question is, how on earth is this possible? Well, the truth is that for years, not much attention was paid to the supply chain. Let's just say that the priority was to buy and develop new war equipment, new planes, new aircraft carriers, new armored vehicles. The problem is that, in the absence of contracts, the capacity to manufacture ammunition and weapon systems that were not so in demand was reduced.
We spend a lot of money on some very exquisite large systems, and we do not spend or focus as much on the munitions necessary to support those. Nobody's buying the weapon systems necessary to engage for anything other than a very, very short-term battle. Gregory Hayes, Raytheon's chief executive.
The point is that the army apparently didn't need it either. Of course, when we cast our minds back to conflicts like Iraq or Afghanistan, where the military superiority was so clear that there was no need for large deployments. However, if on the other hand, we think of China and a hypothetical conflict in Taiwan, things change completely. In such circumstances, the need for ammunition could far exceed current stocks and production capacity. For example, according to a series of analyses and war games developed by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a leading US think tank, in the event of a clash with China, the United States could run out of long-range munitions and precision-guided weapons in less than a week. That is precisely what explains news headlines like this.
US Navy looks to drastically increase missile production.
The problem is that turning this around takes a long time. It requires skilled labor, investment in new factories, or expansion of existing ones, building logistics networks, and so on and so forth. Remember, for example, the case of the Stinger missile. The CEO of Raytheon, the company that manufactures it, said that resuming production of that piece of equipment would take no less than 18 months. To make matters worse, it is not just the United States. The vast majority of its allies are in a very similar situation, thus multiplying the problem. Let's take, for example, a look at the case of Ukraine. Look at it. According to many analysts, this country could and should be firing at least 250,000 artillery shells a month, but they are firing less than half of that number. Why? Well, because the 12 European companies that manufacture the necessary ammunition barely have the capacity to produce 650,000 projectiles in a whole year. And in the case of the United States, production stands at approximately 20,000 shells per month. That is not even the end of it. It's also very difficult to find some basic components that are manufactured in the United States and not in countries like China. This is considered a clear risk for national security. For example, in September 2022, all deliveries of new F-35s were halted for a period of time. They found a Chinese-made alloy in some components. Well, at this point in time, the Biden administration included in its budget request to Congress an increase of more than 50% to purchase missiles and ammunition, with the idea not only to replenish the stock delivered to Ukraine, but also to start re-establishing the supply chains. Along these lines, the production of artillery shells, for example, is expected to increase by 500% in just 2 years.
When it comes to munitions, make no mistake, we are buying to the limits of the industrial base, even as we are expanding those limits. And we're continuing to cut through red tape and accelerate timelines.
However, do you think that this is where all the problems in the production chain end? Well, you're very, very wrong. Take a look.
Pentagon's dated budget process too slow to beat China, new report says. Catch up. China is getting new weapons faster than the US.
Basically, the time it takes the Pentagon to identify a need and award a contract has increased 7-fold since the 1950s. Let's just say the process has become too slow and cumbersome.
I would tell you anecdotally that China is still, after gains we've made in the last 5 years or so, about 5 to 6 times faster than us in acquisition. And in purchasing power parity, they spend about $1 to our $20 to get to the same capability.
But having reached this point, it's your turn. Do you think the US will maintain its global dominance for the next few decades? What do you think is the biggest problem of all? Will China catch up? Leave us your impressions in the comments and let's open up a debate. And you know, if you found this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik. Once again, thank you so very much for being there. All the best. See you next time.